In the bitter February of 1794, in the newly settled Ohio Valley, the wind found every flaw in August Brenner's cabin. It was not a gentle wind, but a blade of ice that seemed to shear the heat from the world, leaving a silence broken only by the snap of freezing timber and the hiss of the fire. Inside, the air was a tapestry of extremes. August and his wife, Ilara, sat huddled on a crude bench, their faces scorched by the roaring blaze in their massive fieldstone fireplace, while their backs slowly numbed with a damp, pervasive cold. The fire was a monster, a glutton. It consumed whole logs of oak and hickory that August had spent his entire autumn felling and splitting, and in return it gave them a small circle of blistering heat and a house full of smoke and draughts. The cabin, built in the American fashion his neighbors had insisted upon, was failing them. August watched the flames, not with comfort, but with a growing, quiet anger. The fire was a lie. He could see the proof in the tin cup of water on the table, just 10 feet from the hearth. A skin of ice had formed on its surface. He could feel the proof in the cold air that snaked across the puncheon floor, a river of chill that moved toward the fireplace, drawn in by the very chimney meant to save them. The massive opening, wide enough to roast a deer, as his neighbor Silas Vane had boasted, was a hole, a vacuum, sucking the meager warmth of their lives out into the night and pulling the frozen wilderness in as a replacement. Ilara coughed, a dry, hacking sound that echoed in the smoky air. She pulled the wool blanket tighter around their infant son, whose face was pale in the flickering, inadequate light. This was the problem. Not the wolves, not the isolation, but the cold. The cold was a guest that had moved in, and the fire, their supposed protector, was its accomplice. August looked at the broad, cold hearthstone at his feet. It was thick, solid, and barely warm to the touch. All the heat was going up, straight into the frigid Ohio sky. He thought of his childhood in Saxony, a place of deep snows and winters that bit with equal fury. He thought of his grossvater's house, not a draughty log box, but a solid plastered home. And in the center of the main room, the stube, had stood the cachalofen, the tile stove. It was a great, ceramic beast that was not a fireplace at all, but a presence. It had no roaring open mouth. It had only a small iron door, and his grandfather would feed it a small armful of wood in the morning. The fire would roar inside its belly for an hour, and then it was gone. But the stove would breathe warmth for the entire day and through the night. A gentle, steady heat you could press your back against. Here, in this new world, they had so much wood they measured it in acres, yet they had no warmth. They had only fire. He realized, as the wind screamed and the back wall of his cabin crackled with frost, that his neighbors had taught him to build a shelter, but they had not taught him how to build a home. They had taught him to fight the cold with a bonfire, and the bonfire was losing. The cabin had been built in the summer of 1793, a year after they arrived with their meager belongings and a grant for 200 acres of dense, unwelcoming forest. August was a cooper by trade, a man who understood the geometry of wood and the necessity of a tight seal, but he was new to this land, and he deferred to the local wisdom. The wisdom was personified by Silas Vane, a tall, gaunt man who had been carving a life from this valley for a decade. "You build with what the land gives," Silas had instructed, his voice rough as bark. "Oak for the floor, poplar or chestnut for the walls, and you set your chimney on the north gable, wide and deep, to brace against the wind." August had followed the directions precisely. He and Ilara had spent weeks felling the massive trees, skidding them to the site, and hewing them flat on two sides with a broadaxe. He notched the corners in the saddle cope style, a tight fit. He split hickory for the roof shakes, and then the chimney. It took him a month. He laid a massive foundation of riverstone, then built the fireplace opening high enough for a man to stand in. The chimney itself was a mix of smaller stones and a wattle and daub mixture of clay and straw, built around a wooden flue form that he would later burn out. It was a monument to frontier tradition, and it was a catastrophe. The problem began the first time the temperature dropped. The sheer volume of the chimney flue, designed to prevent the volatile pitch pine smoke from filling the cabin, created a powerful, constant updraft. It was a perfect engine for sucking air. This meant that to stay warm, August had to keep a massive fire burning. The fire demanded a constant supply of oxygen, which it pulled from the cabin interior. This, in turn, pulled cold, freezing air through every single crack in the cabin's construction, the gaps in the chinking, the space under the door, the imperfections in the roof. The more he fed the fire, the stronger the drafts became. He was living in a blacksmith's bellows. The daily cost was staggering. He spent 4 hours of every daylight winter day felling, bucking, splitting, and hauling firewood. The wood he had thought would last them 3 winters was half gone by January. Ilara's life was a constant battle against the smoke that puffed back into the room with every gust of wind, coating every surface with a layer of greasy soot, and the damp chill that seemed to cling to their very bones. They were exhausted, not from the work of the frontier, but from the simple, metabolic drain of trying to stay warm. August tried to fix it. He re-chinked the entire cabin with a fresh mixture of clay, mud, and dried grass, working in the freezing cold until his fingers were numb and cracked. He hung a heavy quilt over the door. He even tried to narrow the fireplace opening with a screen of green logs, but they simply dried, smoked, and then caught fire. Nothing worked. The flaw was not in the execution. It was in the design. He sat one night, staring into the flames, defeated. "Why is it not working?" he had asked Silas Vane when the man had stopped by to trade tobacco. Silas had clapped him on the back, sending a puff of chimney soot from August's shirt. "It's working fine, Brenner. A fire that big keeps the wolves from scratching at the door. It's winter. It's supposed to be cold." August looked at the man, who seemed perfectly comfortable in his own skin, and realized the problem was deeper. Vane and the others had acclimated to this misery. They accepted it as the cost of living. But August knew it wasn't. He knew with the certainty of a craftsman that there was a better way. The memory of the Cachalofen was no longer just a nostalgic warmth. It was a technical diagram, a blueprint for survival. The change began not with a mentor, but with a memory. As the bitter winter ground on, August spent his evenings by the hungry fire, not resting but remembering. He closed his eyes and summoned the image of his grandfather's stove in Saxony. It was not a fire. It was a machine for heat. He tried to reconstruct it in his mind, piece by piece. His hands, though calloused and raw from the axe, moved in the air, tracing shapes. He remembered the stove was tall, reaching almost to the ceiling, and it sat in the middle of the house, a warm spine that heated both the stube and the kitchen behind it. He remembered the small cast-iron door of the firebox, barely a foot square. He remembered the sound of the fire inside it, a short, violent roar, a clean fire that burned fast and bright, unlike the smouldering, smoky mess in his own hearth. Most importantly, He remembered his grandfather closing a small metal handle, a damper, after the fire had burned down to embers. He was trapping the heat, not letting it fly up the chimney. He tried to explain this to Ilara, using charcoal to sketch on a piece of smooth poplar bark. "The fire is small," he said, drawing a box at the bottom. "But the smoke does not go straight up. It is forced to walk." He drew a winding path, a maze. It goes up, then sideways, then down, then up again. It touches every part of the stove's belly before it is allowed to leave. By the time the smoke escapes, it is cold. All the heat is left behind in the stone. Ilara, practical and worn, traced the lines with her finger. "But where does the smoke go?" "Out a small flue through the roof," he said, sketching a narrow pipe. "It is not a chimney, it is a breath." This internal diagram was his only guide. He had no mentor but his own memory, and the hard-earned knowledge of his current failure. He also learned from the land. He watched how the snow built up in drifts, revealing the patterns of the wind. He noticed that the south-facing side of a great stone warmed in the weak winter sun, and it held that warmth long after the sun had passed. It was a mass. He watched a fox curl in its den, a small hole in the earth, and realized it was warm not from a fire, but from its own body heat, contained. The American fireplace was a hole in the wall. He would build a container. His decision was made. He would not wait for spring. He would build now, inside the cabin. His plan was met with disbelief. Silas Vane visited again, bringing a haunch of venison. He saw August's sketches on the bark, saw the section of floorboards he had begun to pull up in the center of the room. "What in God's name are you doing, man?" Vane asked, baffled. "You'll freeze us out," Ilara had whispered, her fear palpable. "No," August said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I'm going to make us warm." He explained his idea to Silas, the baffled, convoluted smoke path, the small firebox, the massive, heat-holding brick structure. Silas listened, shaking his head. "You're building a baker's oven, Brenner, and you're building it where your table should be. It won't heat the cabin. It'll smoke you out. You're blocking the chimney." "I am tearing down the chimney," August replied. Silas stared at him as if he were mad. "You do that, and you'll be dead by morning. You can't fight an Ohio winter with a German bread oven." August picked up his hammer. "It is not a bread oven. It is a spiker oven, a storage heater. And I am not fighting the winter. I am using it. I am trapping the fire." Silas left, convinced his German neighbor had finally broken. August turned to Ilara, his face set. "We will be cold for 3 days, and then we will be warm forever." The planning phase was a period of intense, focused calculation. August Brenner, with no formal engineering training, became a master of intuitive physics, driven by the memory of comfort and the reality of his family's suffering. He could not build the elegant tiled stove of his homeland. He had no glazed tiles, no cast-iron fittings forged in a centuries-old foundry. He had only the materials of the frontier: clay, sand, stone, and his own 2 hands. His design would be a primitive, brutalist iteration of the sophisticated Kachelofen, but the principle would be the same. The principle was everything. His first challenge was fuel. The new stove, the Mauerofen brick oven, must burn not logs but split wood, and it must burn it hot and fast. This required a small, deep firebox, the opposite of the sprawling American hearth. A small, hot fire meant more complete combustion, which in turn meant less smoke, less soot, and more energy released, as heat, rather than as unburnt particulate. His second challenge was heat transfer. The American fireplace was a radiant heater. It only warmed what it could see. His stove would be a convective and radiant heater, but first it had to capture the heat from the smoke itself. This was the Rockabzug, the smoke pull, the winding maze he had sketched. The hot gases, which could be over 1,000 degrees, would be forced to travel through a long, labyrinthine path of brick channels, surrendering their thermal energy via conduction to the surrounding mass before exiting. The chimney flue would be the last and coldest part of the journey. His third and greatest challenge was thermal mass. The stove needed to be a heat battery. It had to be massive, dense, capable of absorbing the ferocious heat of a 2-hour fire and then radiating it back into the room for 24 hours. He needed bricks. Hundreds of them. The ground outside was frozen solid. He could not dig clay, but he remembered a small, sheltered creek bed he had found in the fall, where a rich, blue-grey clay vein was exposed. For 3 days, in the biting cold, he chipped away at the frozen earth with a pickaxe, loading the heavy, icy clay onto a small sled and dragging it back to the cabin. He brought it inside, placing it near the failing fireplace to thaw. The cabin became a mud pit. Ilara, seeing the grim determination in his eyes, said nothing, only moved their sleeping pallets to the far corner. He made a simple wooden mold. He mixed the thawing clay with sand he had gathered from the riverbank last summer and straw from their thin mattresses. He molded each brick by hand, his fingers aching and stiff, and set them in rows around the dwindling fire to dry. The cabin filled with the damp, earthy smell of curing clay. He built a temporary kiln, a clamp, inside the massive failed fireplace. He stacked the dried, green bricks in a careful lattice, leaving channels for the heat. Then he built a furious, roaring fire in the hearth, feeding it for 2 solid days, channeling all its wasteful heat into the task of firing his new bricks. The cabin became a furnace, smoky and almost unbearable. Silas Vane, seeing the smoke pouring from the chimney, assumed Brenner was burning his furniture for warmth and shook his head at the tragedy. But when the fire died and August dismantled the clamp, he had them. 200 crude, reddish-brown and imperfect bricks. They were hard as stone. They were the building blocks of his new world. He started immediately. He had already sealed the massive fireplace opening with rough sawn boards and packed the gaps with mud and moss. He now had to build the foundation for the new stove, which would weigh well over a ton. He ripped up the puncheon floorboards in the center of the cabin, dug into the cold earth beneath, and laid a solid footing of the fieldstones he had salvaged from the old hearth. He was, quite literally, building his new hearth from the ruins of the old. The construction began in the dim, smoky light of the cabin, the air still thick with the residual chill of the dying American fireplace. August Brenner worked with a focused intensity, a craftsman possessed by a single, driving idea. He laid the first course of his precious hand-formed bricks on the stone foundation, using a mortar of pure clay and sand. This was the base, solid and wide. Then he began to form the channels. His design, sketched on bark and held in his mind, was complex. He built the firebox first, small and deep, lined with the hardest, most well-fired bricks that would have to withstand the highest temperatures. He left a small opening for air, with a crude door of beaten scrap iron he'd scavenged from a broken wagon wheel. Above the firebox, he built a small, black oven chamber, a space that would capture the first, most intense blast of heat, perfect for baking. This, he thought, would please Ilara, but the true genius was what happened next. From the firebox he forced the smoke and hot gas to travel. He built a brick channel that went straight up for 3 feet, then hit a solid capstan, forcing it to turn and travel down through 2 parallel side channels that ran the full height of the stove. At the bottom, the gases collected and were then pulled sideways into a final narrow flue that traveled back up the center of the mass and out through a small, insulated pipe that he vented through the roof ridge. It was a contraflow design, a vertical serpentine. The smoke was being forced to travel nearly 20 feet, all inside the brick monolith, before it could escape. He was wringing every last degree of heat from his fuel. Ilara watched him, her initial fear replaced by a quiet awe. He was not just laying bricks, he was building an engine. He was sculpting a solution from memory and mud. He packed the space between the inner flue channels and the outer brick skin of the stove with a mixture of sand and smaller stone rubble. This, he knew, would add to the thermal mass, acting as the core of his heat battery. The stove grew, course by course, until it was a solid rectangular pillar of reddish brick, 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, standing directly in the center of the small, one-room cabin. It was not beautiful. It lacked the fine ceramic tiles of Saxony. It was primitive, earthen, and powerful. It dominated the room. His neighbors, hearing of the project, came to see. Silas Vane stood at the doorway, his arms crossed. "It's a tomb, Brenner," he said, his voice flat. "You've built a brick tomb in the middle of your house, and you've no fireplace. What will you do when the real cold comes?" August had just set the final flue pipe through the roof, sealing it with a thick collar of clay. He was covered in soot and mud. He looked at Vane, then at the massive, silent brick structure. "I will wait," he said. He let the clay mortar cure for 3 days. The cabin grew dangerously cold. The fire in the old hearth was gone, its opening sealed. They lived in their blankets, their breath pluming in the air. On the 4th morning, with the temperature outside at 10 degrees below zero, August Brenner decided it was time. The test began on the coldest morning of the year. The air was so sharp it hurt to breathe, and the trees in the forest cracked like rifle shots. Inside the cabin, the temperature was just above freezing. Ilara and the baby were bundled in every blanket they owned. August Brenner approached the stove. His hands were steady. He had saved a small bundle of the driest, split hickory just for this moment. He opened the small iron door of the new firebox. It was barely large enough to admit his arm. He laid the wood carefully, building a small, dense pile. He lit it with a single ember he had kept alive in a foxfire tin. The wood caught. He left the door cracked for air and watched. The fire did not smolder. With the strong, direct pull of the new flue, it erupted into a clean, white-hot roar. The sound was different, a contained, efficient fury, not the lazy, crackling sprawl of the old hearth. He let it burn, feeding it a few more pieces of wood for exactly 2 hours. The firebox glowed a pale orange. The fire consumed the wood completely, leaving only a small pile of fine white ash. Then, as the last flames died to embers, August did what his grandfather had taught him. He closed the iron firebox door, sealing it tight. Then he reached for a small metal lever he had built into the flue pipe, a damper. He closed it. He had trapped the fire. The cabin was silent. There was no crackling hearth, no roaring updraft. There was only the sound of the wind outside. Silas Vane, who had heard about the first firing, appeared at the door, wrapped in furs. "Well, Brenner," he said, a note of grim pity in his voice. Is it a furnace or a grave? It's not a furnace, August said. He motioned for Silas to come in. The air in the cabin was still bitingly cold. Silas smirked. August ignored him and walked to the stove. He placed his bare hand on the brick exterior. It was still cold. An hour passed. August and Ilara sat waiting. Silas, too curious to leave, paced the cold floor. "Nothing," he said. "All that work. Nothing." "Wait," August said. He went to the stove and placed his hand on it again. A flicker of something. It was no longer cold. It was neutral. The brick was no longer stealing the heat from his hand. Another hour passed. The change was undeniable. A very faint, gentle warmth began to radiate from the brick. It was not the scorching heat of the old fire. It was a pervasive basal warmth, like the heat from a sun-warmed stone. Silas stopped pacing and stood near it, confused. "It's warm," he muttered, holding out his hands. "But there's no fire." "The fire is gone," August said. "The heat is in the brick." By noon, the stove was radiating a steady, powerful heat. The entire 800 cubic foot cabin began to thaw. The ice on the tin cup melted. The frost on the walls receded. By 3:00 p.m., the cabin was not just less cold, it was comfortable. Ilara unswaddled the baby, whose cheeks became pink for the first time in weeks. Silas Vane, who had come to mock, had long since taken off his heavy fur coat. He sat on the bench, sweating slightly. He touched the brick. It was hot, but not scorching. You could lean against it. "I don't understand," Silas said, his voice full of awe. "The fire's been out for 6 hours." "The fire did its job," August said. "Now the stove does its job." That night, the true test came. A blizzard descended, and the temperature dropped to 20 below. In his own cabin, Silas Vane would be up every 2 hours, feeding the insatiable maw of his fireplace. But in August Brenner's cabin there was no fire. They went to sleep. August woke once at 3:00 a.m. to the sound of the wind. He was not cold. He was, in fact, too warm. He had kicked off his blanket. The baby was sleeping soundly. He got up and walked in his bare feet on the puncheon floor. The floor was warm. He placed his hand on the stove. The brick monolith was still pouring heat into the room, a gentle, unwavering, radiant warmth. He had fired it once, and it was still working. He had not just built a stove. He had broken the back of the Ohio winter. Word of the German miracle spread through the settlement as the blizzard raged and subsided. The trail to August Brenner's cabin, once lonely, became well-worn. One by one, the neighbors came. They came not to mock, but to learn. They would enter the cabin, stamping snow from their boots, their faces raw from the cold, and stop dead in the center of the room. The first thing that struck them was the silence. There was no roaring fire. The second was the air. It was warm, clear, and still. There were no draughts. And the third was the stove itself, the solid brick heart of the home, radiating a steady, effortless warmth. Silas Vane was the first. He brought not tobacco, but his tools. "Show me, Brenner," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Show me the smoke trap." August, seeing not a rival but a fellow survivor, took him to the creek bed and showed him the clay. He sketched the diagrams again, explaining the principles of the contraflow, the small firebox, the necessity of the damper. "It is not the size of the fire, Silas. It is the journey of the smoke." That spring, a rash of brick-making hit the settlement. The Brenner stove, or German chimney as it came to be known, was replicated. The first attempts were crude. Men who understood log work struggled with mortar and flue physics, but August helped. He showed them how to build the forms, how to stack the clamp kiln, how to lay the channels. He became the settlement's unofficial engineer. The innovation didn't just spread, it adapted. Not everyone was willing to tear down their existing chimney. So August designed a hybrid. A heat-catcher mass of brick built behind the existing fireplace, with a flue that diverted the hot gases through it before they could escape. It was less efficient, but it was a vast improvement, capturing 40% of the heat that was once wasted. Other settlers, building new cabins, adopted the central stove design outright. Within 5 years, the character of the settlement had changed. The vast, smoky, drafty cabins of the first arrivals were replaced by warmer, tighter, more efficient homes. The impact was profound. Fuel consumption dropped by more than 2/3. The grueling, all-day labor of cutting wood was reduced to a manageable chore. Families were healthier. The persistent winter cough that plagued the settlement disappeared as the air cleared of smoke and the damp chill was banished. Women could bake bread in the integrated ovens, and children could play on the floor without fear of frostbite. The stove became the center of domestic life, a place to gather, to dry clothes, to warm aching bodies. Its legacy was quiet, but absolute. Decades later, travelers passing through the region would note the unusual efficiency of the cabins and the small, tidy woodpiles. The technique, divorced from its origin, had simply become the way things were done. August Brenner's memory of a Saxon stove forged in the desperation of an Ohio winter had become a new American vernacular, a quiet testament to the power of a single, correct idea. What August Brenner had built, driven by intuitive memory and practical need, was a masterpiece of thermal engineering. The flaw in the American frontier fireplace was not one of intent, but of physics. It was a radiant heater, but it was also a powerful convective vacuum. By creating a massive open flue, it operated at a catastrophic inefficiency, often losing more than 90% of the fire's heat straight up the chimney. Worse, this updraft, the chimney effect, drew in more cold air than the fire could possibly heat, resulting in a net loss of warmth for the building. It was an engine designed to make a house colder. August's Mauerofen, or masonry heater, was a different beast entirely. It was a system for heat management. The first principle was complete combustion. The small, deep and airtight firebox, fed with dry wood, created an incredibly hot, fast fire, often reaching 500 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the wood burned cleanly and completely, releasing its maximum energy and destroying the volatile compounds that would otherwise become smoke and creosote. This made the stove both more efficient and vastly safer. The second and most critical principle was heat transfer and storage. This was the Rauschabzug, the serpentine smoke path. Instead of letting that 500-degree gas escape, August forced it on a long, slow, convoluted journey through the brick channels. The hot gases were forced into conduction with the stove's mass. The bricks, like a dry sponge, soaked up this thermal energy. By the time the gases finally exited the flue, they were often as cool as 300 degrees, having surrendered over 80% of their heat to the stove. The third principle was thermal mass. The stove, weighing over a ton, was a thermal battery. It was designed to absorb the massive, short-term energy release from that 2-hour fire, and then radiate it back into the room slowly and evenly. This was the magic that Silas Vane could not understand. The heater provided a gentle, low-temperature, radiant heat which warms objects. The floors, the walls, the furniture, the people, rather than just heating the air, which would quickly leak out. What August Brenner had built was, in modern terms, a high-efficiency, clean-burning, passive thermal storage heating system. He had solved the problem of survival, not with more work, but with better design. He had anticipated the core principles of building science a century before the term existed, proving that practical, on-the-ground innovation, born of necessity, often outpaces formal theory. August Brenner lived to be an old man. He watched the Ohio Valley transform from a hostile forest to a landscape of farms and villages. His own cabin, eventually expanded and clapboarded, stood for decades, anchored by the massive brick monolith in its center. The stove outlived him and outlived his children. It became a local landmark, the Brenner Hearth, and it continued to warm his grandchildren, a silent, steady presence in their lives. He had brought more than his tools and his trade to the new world. He had brought a physical memory of comfort, a piece of cultural knowledge that proved to be one of the most powerful survival tools of all. His neighbors, who had once pitied his folly, came to revere his wisdom. They had learned a fundamental lesson that winter of 1794. They had learned that the loudest solution is rarely the best one. They had been chopping wood while August had been thinking. They had been fighting the cold while August had been managing energy. The stove he built was a testament to a different kind of frontier courage. It was not the courage of the axe, but the courage of the mind. It was the wisdom to stop and question a system that everyone else accepts, to look at a failing design and have the audacity to build something new from first principles. It was a lesson in working with nature, not against it. The American hearth was a battle, a constant roaring and ultimately losing fight against the winter. The Brenner stove was a negotiation. It accepted the fire's power, tamed it, stored it, and made it civilized. It taught that true comfort comes not from a big, wasteful blaze, but from a quiet, enduring, and patient warmth. It proved that the most resilient designs are often the ones that store energy for the long haul, the ones that value efficiency over effort, and that the true measure of innovation is not how much it impresses, but how long it endures.